Some people spend their entire lives chasing wealth. Others spend their wealth searching for something money can never buy. At 73, billionaire Edward Harrington had everything the world admired. But every night, he returned to a mansion filled with silence. One autumn afternoon, he disguised himself as a homeless man and sat alone in a public park, hoping to answer one painful question. If the world believed I had nothing, would anyone still care? Before the day ended, a 12-year-old boy would give him an answer he would never forget. The invisible wealth. Some people spend their lives building fortunes. Others spend their fortunes searching for something they lost long ago. At 73, Edward Harrington had everything the world admired. His companies stretched across continents. His wealth was measured in billions. His name appeared in magazines, business journals, and charity events. People called him a visionary, a legend, one of the most successful men in America. Yet every night, he unlocked the front door of a mansion that felt painfully empty. 5 years had passed since his wife, Evelyn, died. The house she had once filled with laughter had become unbearably quiet. The dining table built for family dinners now held a single plate. The fireplace still burned every evening, but it no longer felt warm. Success had given Edward everything, except someone to share it with. The phone never stopped ringing. Executives wanted meetings. Investors wanted advice. Lawyers wanted signatures. Even distant relatives suddenly remembered his birthday. But no one ever called to ask a simple question. How are you? One sleepless night, Edward found himself sitting alone in his library, staring at an old photograph of Evelyn. She wasn't smiling at the camera. She was smiling at him. For a long moment, he simply looked at the picture. Then he whispered something he had never admitted out loud. I don't know who's real anymore. The words echoed through the empty room. A painful thought followed. If I lost everything tomorrow, would anyone still stop for me? Not because of my money, not because of my name, just because I needed help. That question stayed with him for days, then weeks, until it became impossible to ignore. One cold autumn morning, Edward canceled every appointment on his calendar. His assistant assumed he needed rest. His board believed he was handling a private matter. Even his security team was told to stay home. No one knew what he was about to do. He drove across the city alone. Inside the trunk of his car was a small paper bag. It held an old coat from a thrift store, a faded pair of boots, and a worn wool cap. He changed inside a public restroom. The tailored suit disappeared. The polished shoes were gone. His expensive watch remained locked inside the glove compartment. When he looked into the mirror, the billionaire was gone. Staring back at him was an exhausted old man the world would never notice twice. Exactly what he wanted. Less than 20 minutes later, Edward walked into Willow Creek Park. The afternoon was beautiful. Golden leaves drifted gently through the trees. Children laughed around the fountain. A street musician played a soft melody that floated through the cool air. Life felt warm, hopeful, ordinary. Edward quietly sat down on an old wooden bench beneath the largest oak tree in the park. He rested his hands across his lap, closed his eyes, and waited. The first few minutes passed peacefully. Someone walked by. Their footsteps slowed, then continued. Another person stopped nearby. Edward almost opened his eyes. Instead, he heard the unmistakable sound of a phone camera. A picture, then footsteps fading into the distance. He wasn't a person. He was a moment. A businessman hurried past while speaking into a headset. A young couple glanced at him before looking away. An elderly woman searched through her handbag. Edward's heartbeat quietly lifted. Perhaps she was reaching for a bottle of water. Instead, she pulled out her car keys and kept walking. Time passed. The park grew busier. Children laughed. Dogs chased tennis balls. Conversations filled the air. Hundreds of lives crossed his path. Yet not a single one crossed the short distance between the path and his bench. Nearly 2 hours slipped away. Not one stranger asked if he was hungry. Not one offered him a drink. Not one sat beside him. Edward had spent decades believing that wealth separated people. Today, he discovered something even more painful. To most of the world, need was invisible. A quiet sigh escaped his lips. Maybe he had been wrong all these years. Maybe kindness hadn't disappeared. Maybe people had simply stopped noticing. Slowly, he placed both hands against the bench. The experiment was over. He had his answer. He leaned forward, ready to stand. Then, he heard footsteps. Not hurried, not careless. Small. They came closer, stopped, and didn't move. A few silent seconds passed. Edward remained perfectly still. So did the stranger. Then he heard the gentle sound of a backpack being placed on the ground. His heartbeat quickened. For the first time that afternoon, someone had chosen to stay. A soft voice finally broke the silence. "Sir, are you okay?" Edward didn't move. His eyes remained closed. His breathing stayed slow and steady. The child waited. "Sir?" Still no answer. A few seconds slipped by. Most people would have assumed the old man was asleep, or decided it wasn't their problem. This boy did neither. Edward heard cautious footsteps move closer. Then, a gentle hand rested near his shoulder. Not to shake him, only to make sure he was breathing. The touch lasted barely a second, but it carried more kindness than Edward had received from strangers in years. The boy let out a quiet breath of relief. Thank goodness. Edward's heart tightened. The child hadn't stopped because he was curious. He had stopped because he was worried. A zipper slowly opened. The boy searched through his backpack. There was no rush, no hesitation, only quiet determination. A plastic bottle clicked softly against something inside the bag. A moment later, it was placed beside Edward's hand. Half full. Nothing more. Nothing less. It wasn't much, but it was probably everything the boy had to drink until he got home. Edward felt a lump rise in his throat. He had spent a lifetime receiving gifts wrapped in expensive boxes. Luxury watches, rare paintings, sports cars. None of them had ever carried the weight of a half-empty bottle of water. Because those gifts had been bought with money. This one had been given with compassion. The boy waited again, watching, hoping the old man would wake up. When Edward remained still, the child quietly opened his backpack for a second time. This time, Edward heard the faint crinkle of paper. Carefully folded, carefully protected. The smell reached him before the sound stopped. Fresh bread, a simple homemade sandwich. The boy placed it beside the bottle with the same care someone might use while placing flowers on a grave. Edward's chest ached. He didn't need to see the sandwich to understand its story. It wasn't restaurant food. It wasn't something bought on the way to the park. Someone had woken up early that morning, made it with love, wrapped it by hand, and trusted it would keep a little boy from going hungry at school. Now, it belonged to a stranger. Edward had negotiated billion-dollar deals without losing his composure. But this nearly broke him. Who gives away their lunch? To someone they've never met? The boy stood quietly. Edward heard the backpack slide over his shoulders. The footsteps slowly drifted away. 1, 2, 3. Edward almost opened his eyes. Then, the footsteps stopped. Silence. A long, thoughtful silence. The backpack slipped from the boy's shoulders once again. Edward's heartbeat quickened. Whatever the child was about to do next would change everything. The footsteps slowly faded into the distance. Edward almost opened his eyes. Almost. Then the wind changed. The gentle autumn breeze turned cold, carrying the scent of rain through the park. A low rumble of thunder echoed overhead. People looked toward the sky. Within seconds, the first raindrops began to fall. Children ran toward their parents. Joggers rushed for cover. The street musician packed away his violin. Laughter disappeared. The park emptied almost as quickly as it had filled. Edward remained exactly where he was. Rain soaked through his old coat. Cold water dripped from his cap and onto the wooden bench. Still, he didn't move. His experiment wasn't over yet. Not until the last person had walked away. Minutes passed. The rain only grew heavier. Then, through the steady rhythm of falling rain, he heard footsteps again. Fast, small, coming toward him, not away. They stopped beside the bench. Edward recognized them instantly. The boy had returned. He was breathing hard, as though he had run back without thinking. For a few seconds, neither of them moved. Then Edward felt something warm settle across his shoulders. A jacket, old, thin, still carrying the warmth of the child who had been wearing it only moments earlier. The boy gently pulled it around him, careful to cover his chest before stepping back into the rain. Edward's fingers tightened around the edge of the bench. The jacket wasn't expensive. It wasn't even dry anymore. But somehow, it felt heavier than every luxury suit hanging in his mansion. Because no one gives away the only jacket they're wearing. Unless kindness matters more than comfort. The rain grew colder. The wind cut through the trees. Edward could hear the boy shivering. He rubbed his hands together, coughed once, shifted from one foot to the other to stay warm. Yet he never reached for the jacket. Not even once. Edward's heart ached. He had spent decades surrounded by people asking, asterisk, what can you give me? Asterisk, this child had asked only one question. Asterisk, are you okay? Asterisk, without another thought. Edward slowly opened his eyes. The boy jumped slightly. Oh, I thought you were asleep. Edward looked at him for the first time. He couldn't have been older than 12. His sneakers were worn. His backpack looked older than he was. Rain clung to his hair, running down his face. Yet despite the cold, he smiled. Not because he expected anything. Simply because the old man was awake. Edward glanced at the bottle. Then the sandwich. Finally, the jacket resting across his shoulders. His voice came out barely above a whisper. These are yours. The boy shrugged. You needed them more. Edward stared at him. You don't even know me. The boy smiled again. I don't have to. For a moment, Edward couldn't speak. In boardrooms, he had negotiated billion-dollar deals without hesitation. Now, a single sentence from a 12-year-old had stolen every word he had. After a long silence, he finally asked, why would you help someone you've never met? The boy looked toward the rain for a second. When he answered, his voice was quiet, almost thoughtful. My mom always says, if kindness only costs you what's left over, it isn't kindness. Edward felt his throat tighten. The boy wasn't giving away extra food. He wasn't sharing an extra bottle of water. He wasn't offering a spare jacket. He had given away the things he still needed himself. Edward lowered his head. For the first time in years, his eyes filled with tears. He wasn't crying because he was cold. He was crying because a child with almost nothing had reminded him what it meant to be truly rich. After a long silence, Edward looked back at him. What is your name? The boy adjusted the straps of his backpack and smiled. Ethan. Edward quietly repeated it to himself. Ethan. He didn't know why, but deep inside, he knew he would never forget that name. The rain had almost stopped. Edward and Ethan stood facing each other in silence. Neither of them seemed ready to leave. Edward looked at the small boy whose kindness had accomplished something that billions of dollars never could. It had reached his heart. After a long pause, Edward asked quietly, where did you learn to care about strangers? Ethan smiled. My mom. She says you never really know what someone is carrying. So if you can make their day a little lighter, you should. Edward lowered his eyes. For years, he had carried a loneliness no one had ever noticed. Yet somehow, a 12-year-old boy had. What about your father? Edward asked. The smile faded. He died when I was 6. And your mom? She cleans offices at night. Sometimes she works 2 jobs. Edward glanced at the sandwich lying beside the bottle. That was your lunch, wasn't it? Ethan nodded. I'll eat when I get home. Edward closed his eyes for a moment. No boardroom victory, no business award, no billion-dollar investment had ever humbled him like those 5 simple words. Slowly, he removed the jacket from his shoulders. You need this more than I do. Ethan gently pushed it back. My mom would be disappointed if I left you out here in the rain. Edward couldn't help smiling. Your mother sounds like a remarkable woman. I think so too. For the first time in years. Edward laughed. Not the polite laugh he used during interviews. A real one. Before leaving, he held out his hand. My name is Edward. Ethan. Their hands met. A billionaire. A schoolboy. Neither of them realized that this simple handshake would change both of their lives forever. 3 weeks passed. Edward searched every afternoon. He returned to Willow Creek Park again and again. Sometimes he sat on the same bench. Sometimes he simply watched families walking by. But Ethan never appeared. Just when he began to think they might never meet again. One of his employees recognized the boy from a nearby community center. Edward didn't send lawyers. He didn't send assistants. He went himself. When the apartment door opened, Ethan froze. You? Edward smiled. I told you my name. But you never told me yours. Ethan laughed. I did. I meant. The real you. Edward nodded. I suppose I didn't. He stepped inside the small apartment. It was clean. Simple. Every piece of furniture had been repaired more than once. Yet somehow, it felt warmer than his mansion had in years. A woman entered from the kitchen. She immediately apologized. I'm sorry if Ethan bothered you at the park. Edward looked at her in disbelief. Bothered me. He smiled. Your son reminded me who I used to be. She looked confused. Edward reached into his coat and placed a photograph on the table. It was a newspaper clipping. His face covered the front page. Ethan stared at it. His eyes grew wide. You're Edward Harrington, the billionaire? Edward nodded. Ethan looked back toward the rainy day jacket still hanging near the door. You already had everything. Edward slowly shook his head. No, I only thought I did. Silence filled the room. Then Edward continued. You were kind to me when you believed I had nothing. That's the kind of person this world needs. He turned toward Ethan's mother. You raised an extraordinary son. Tears filled her eyes. I only taught him what his father taught us. If you ever have the chance to make someone's burden a little lighter, don't wait. Edward never forgot those words. Over the following years, he quietly paid for Ethan's education. He made sure his mother never worried about rent again. He helped them rebuild their lives. Not through charity, but through opportunity. No cameras. No press conferences. No speeches. Because kindness loses its meaning the moment it asks to be admired. Years later, during an interview, a reporter smiled and asked, Mr. Harrington, you've built companies worth billions. What is the greatest investment you've ever made? Edward smiled. His mind returned to an old wooden bench. A rainy afternoon. A half-empty bottle of water. A homemade sandwich. A faded little jacket. And a boy who thought he was helping a homeless stranger. Edward looked into the camera. The greatest investment I ever made was believing that kindness still exists. Then he smiled again, because somewhere in the world, a little boy still had no idea that the smallest act of kindness had made one lonely old man feel rich again.